a master's degree in migration studies from the University of Oxford and was awarded her PhD in 2018 by the Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam for her research on border deaths in the Mediterranean region. And she has previously consulted for UNRIZ and IOM. Thank you very much, Tamara. Let me read very quickly the name of all the panelists, and then we will start with each of you. Then we will have Lorena Núñez, who will talk about African migrant women giving birth in South Africa at risk of silent death. Lorena Núñez is a feminist researcher and activist in the women's movement in Latin America in the late 80s and 90s. And she holds a master's degree in development studies from the Institute of Social Studies in The Hague and a PhD in medical anthropology from Leiden University. Her broader academic interest is on topics that intersect culture with culture and health. In her research, both in Latin America and Southern Africa, she explores the linkages between migration and health with a focus on illness experiences, including HIV and AIDS. She has researched African-initiated churches and published on topics of health, faith, and subjectivity in diverse urban spaces. She also coordinates and teaches in the Health Sociology Master's Program at the Department of Sociology at the University of the Witwatersrand. And her ongoing comparative project examines migration, gender, and health care in post-authoritarian regimes in both Chile and South Africa. She has an interest in the topic of dying and death in the context of migration and displacement. And she's currently researching in the context of COVID-19 pandemic and she's also part of a broader NRF-funded research project on the social impact of the South African response to COVID-19. Thank you very much, Lorena, for being here. And then we will have Alethia Fernández de la Reguera, who is going to talk about African female migrant journeys, human rights violations, and the impossibility of access to health services at the southern border of Mexico. Alethia is an associate researcher at the Institute of Legal Research at UNAM, and she is an academic coordinator of the UNAM University of Arizona of the Binational Consortium on Migration, Human Rights, and Human Security. And she is also coordinator of the Erasmus Master's Program, Euroculture at UNAM. She has a PhD with honors in humanistic studies from Tecnológico de Monterrey and a master's degree in European studies from the University of Amsterdam and a BA in international relations from Tecnológico de Monterrey as well. Thank you very much, Alethia. And then we will have Nair Anaya, who is going to talk about alternative views of feminism. Aidoo and Erna Brodber. Nair Anaya is a senior lecturer at the Faculty of Philosophy and Letters at UNAM. She works on English literatures, postcolonial literatures, and translation studies. Her Spanish translation of Tsitsi Dangaremga, Nervous Condition, won the first Bellas Artes Translation Prize, Margarita Michelena, from the government of Hidalgo, Inba. And the last speaker is going to be Rubén Peña, who is going to talk about Sudan, political transition, social mobilization, and gender. Rubén Peña holds a PhD in political and social sciences with a focus on international relations. He has a master's in international studies and a BA in international relations at UNAM. He's a professor at the National Autonomous University of Mexico, the university program of studies on Asia and Africa. And he's a member of the workshop on Middle East studies of the School of Political Sciences at UNAM. His topics of interest are political processes in Africa, state, ethnicity, and religion. Thank you very much, Rubén, for being here. So we will start with Tamara. And Tamara, thank you very much. You have 15 minutes to give your presentation. Thank you.
Hey, thank you very much. I'm gonna try sharing my. Oh, I am disabled from screen sharing.
Let's see, Eric.
You should have the power now. Sorry about that.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Okay. Oh, I'm missing the button. Oh dear. Okay, sorry about that. Should have tried this before.
Don't worry.
So I'm going to be presenting a paper that is written by Tendai Atumi and myself, based on desk research and conversation that was conducted over the last 2 years with, I seem to have lost it. Here we go. Anyone know how I make it big? I'm not used to this. Okay. All right, well, I'll leave it like this. So it's a paper authored by Tendai and myself, based on desk research and conversation that's been conducted also with Medina Taim and Anita Vukovic. I've made the mistake before of trying to fit our currently 34-page paper into a 10-minute presentation. So this time I'm going to do it differently, and I'm going to be much more selective. I want to talk about, I want to make a few methodological notes about our approach to this study. And then I will present some of our main arguments and flesh them out with examples that are appropriate to a panel about women and children migration. And then I will allude to what we plan to do next, or what we are currently working on in our final section of our paper, which is about rethinking reform and going that next step after our critique. So our starting point is that ideally migration legal and policy frameworks justly and effectively govern interconnection. Lives lived through and across borders. Yet the reality that we can see is that Southern African regional migration, legal and policy frameworks, and state practice poorly govern this interconnection, adopting frames and logics at odds with the needs and desires, especially of socioeconomically marginalized Southern Africans. So in taking a historically and sociologically embedded analysis, we were embarking immediately into interdisciplinary work, and hence the need to recognize all the contributors to the paper, even those who don't end up authoring, because Medina was a historian, expert on colonial African history. Then Anita was an anthropologist. Tendai Chume is an international lawyer, and I'm the migration person. So we came together to discuss, and then we walked away to do our desk research. So we are not making any claims to do any original historical research, but rather to try to bring together the historical knowledge that is already recorded through a critical lens, and in conversation with what we know from what we have can learn from anthropology and sociology about the situation of migrants and people on the ground, cross-border people on the ground, and then use that to really frame how we analyzed law and policy at the regional level in SADC, the Southern African Development Community. We don't try to claim that formal law and policy fully or even mostly determine how and when people move. We recognize that informality characterizes the mobility of many Southern Africans, and try to bring this into our critique. Instead, we show that the existing regional and national regimes and their foreseeable trajectory undercut the capacity of migrants to sustain independent livelihoods. And one of our goals is to show that these regimes even undercut the enjoyments of rights and privileges that the SADC has itself identified as entitlements of Southern Africans. So we don't look at law as defining how movement, but we do recognize, we argue that Migration law and policy is part of a bigger function of much deeper and more complex systems and commitments. And it's our view that a reimagining of Southern African borders and migration that attends to their persisting coloniality is a necessity for the region, even if coloniality does not explain everything that is happening at the legal level. We use the term coloniality here to then refer to the tendency to reproduce colonial era inequalities and axes of subordination, exploitation, and benefit, notwithstanding the range of other functions that they can also simultaneously perform. We don't actually, I will get hopefully to that last slide where we're beginning now to think about how we, after our critique, how we go into rethinking reform. But it's not our main goal to pursue radical reimagination in this paper, although who knows where the paper will go. Instead, we take the SADC and its constituent member states as given, and we examine its migration governance framework, highlighting its competitive normative commitments and making explicit the logics that it facilitates, the forces that shape it, as well as the way that it allocates benefits among individuals and communities in the region. We situate our analysis within the colonial history of migration in the region, highlighting the ways in which colonially structured socioeconomic interconnection and resulting migration patterns in the past have relevance for the present. We also highlight continuities in the way that the contemporary migration governance regime facilitates historical patterns of exploitation and precarity, among other things, in a manner that is fundamentally at odds with the decolonial movements and spirit that animated SADC's predecessor formation as the frontline states. Finally, we propose to reorient the reform momentum in the region away from the inertia that's created by European Union-funded knowledge and policy production forces towards trajectories that are more decolonial in nature. So SADC has always been oriented towards economic goals. I move on to the next. SADC has always been oriented towards economic goals. And regional economic communities in general are understood to contribute to the African Union's vision for continental economic integration, a vision that is steeped, we argue, in a predominantly neoliberal approach. But SADC's founding objectives also include collective self-reliance, strengthening and consolidating the long-standing historical, social, and cultural affinities and links among the people of the region, in recognition of the idea that post-colonial justice implicates a commitment to self-determination of Southern Africans at the individual, communal, and collective levels. So we argue that these contradictory logics of decolonization and neoliberal economics are salient and in tension, especially in migration governance. And as a result, migration governance at SADC level is actually out of sync with a lot of other areas of SADC policy development. Moreover, limited capacity at the regional policymaking bodies have led to a de facto dependence on international organizations and the continued importation of principles and instruments from the EU and the US, with limited attention to their suitability for the SADC region, in fact, and in spite of the violent crises that have resulted from the flawed and unjust migration governance regimes characteristic of the EU and the United States. And we argue, here we are starting, we're recently engaging with Tina Tsuvala's book about civilization as capitalism, or capitalism as civilization, where she's and thinking about whether or not this is an importation or an imposition of ideas, or whether it is not post-colonial governments incorporating and redeploying the logics of capitalism and logics that were initially introduced to the region under colonialism. So two related features of the regional legal and policy frameworks that we analyze are first the salience and influence of economic modes of production in shaping migration governance, typically in ways that expose those subject to the frameworks to precarity and exploitation. In other words, SADC and South Africa and many countries in the region understand value or give value to labor migration and understand in which people are understood as labor. But this, if you look at this, so here in this part, we unpack also the history of labor regimes and how actually Southern African economies, and especially South Africa and Zimbabwe, were grown, were created. Their foundations are based on corporate labor regimes that fed the mine and fed extraction economies and basically turned the region into labor supplying and resource extraction areas. And here you look at, there were corporate regimes that were developed in order to supply predominantly mines, that's where they started, but and to recruit migrant labor for that purpose. But then they also, there was support at different points in the colonial history. There was support from legal regimes, the colonial legal regime, but there was also tension between the corporate and legal regimes at other times, creating, for instance, illegal immigration, which Francis Musoni, he does a very good reflection at critiquing this idea that illegalization is this recent phenomenon that we've come up with in migration policy. So here, we think in particular that one of the problems is that in these formal labor regimes, women were not considered suitable for the work that the colonizing and the corporates had designed these labor regimes for. And so women were excluded because they shouldn't be working in the mines or on the farms. So they were excluded, and basically for their migration ended up being unauthorized instead. And this now, we see the history of that, but then you see how today informal cross-border traders who are predominantly women and supply are vital in processes of in networks of food security in rural areas and poor areas, and rely on having to cross borders in order to be able to afford goods and bring them back to the people who, I think immediately of people who crossed the Zimbabwean border into South Africa in order to buy cooking oil, because the price of cooking oil in Zimbabwe is too high. And these are predominantly women because they are not, they don't have the option, they're still excluded from financial schemes, so they don't have the option often to regularize, but also because they are coming from these communities. It's an economy of necessity as well. And then I'm thinking, so then you see how under COVID, where the free movement protocol allows, so SADC has a free movement protocol. It hasn't been ratified yet, but the vision is there. And here you see that there's the possibility for exemption from free movement protocols in states of emergency, such as COVID pandemic. And here you see then people, one of the first things South Africa did at the beginning of the lockdown was to build a barbed wire. They spent 47 million rand on a barbed wire fence they put along the Zimbabwean border, immediately cutting off those vital cross-border trades. Then the other area that we focus on is the failure of these frameworks, these migration frameworks, to ensure sufficient incorporation and associated benefits for migrants in the region, notwithstanding the economic, social, cultural, and arguably political ties that bind them to the countries to which they migrate or in which they live. I think immediately of my Congolese neighbor who is struggling to move her son into another school because he doesn't have paperwork. She has asylum papers, but he doesn't have the right papers in order to access school, and the teachers the headmasters keep telling her that they will be in trouble with the Ministry of Education if they let her child into school. But of course, it's the only place he's ever known and probably the only place he ever will know. in the interest of making sure that everyone else can say something, I will only say one more sentence about rethinking and form, and that's that this is something that we will only begin to do to highlight the work that has already been done, that is already in progress. But here we are thinking about some reform that can actually serve the pieces and recenter SADC's decolonizing agenda that requires some kind of radical imagining that we were hearing about in the keynote just now, and recentering of African values, methods, and archives, drawing on archives that will provide a different, and feeding that up to the policy-making level. But that is where we still would like to do plenty of work. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tamara. We will have now Lorena Núñez. And sorry, I just forgot to say, if you have questions, please, you can use our Q&A chat box. You can use the chat or social media. And if there are no questions, then we will have a round of questions from each of the participants to the rest of the participants. Thank you, Lorena. Thank you for being here.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to see if I can share my screen as well. Okay, yes. Do you see it? Okay.
Yes, it's loading.
Is it loading? Okay. Okay. So I'm happy that Tamara gave a broad context presentation, because I'm going to focus on women migrant in South Africa and women coming from the SADC countries. So maybe we can put these two approaches into conversation. And first, to show these are the routes, the main corridors of intra-regional migration in Africa. And if you see in the east side of East Africa, so all of these arrows point out different directions. These are quite established corridors, and there is then a flow towards South Africa, coming along the Horn of Africa and countries in East Africa: Somalia, Ethiopia, Kenya, Tanzania, Malawi, Mozambique, Zimbabwe. And we have migrants actually undertaking these journeys, and men, women, children, journeys that are very dangerous and that sometimes take quite a long time to reach this destination. And South Africa being a destination of part of these journeys as final destination, but also as a transit country in order to reach North America and the North. So you see also the arrows going everywhere. So imagine these trajectories and the negotiations and the journeys and the hazard that men, women go through to reach destinations and better lives. And in the media, we always hear the images of Africans trying to reach Europe, but actually most of the movement and most of the migration is intra-regional, and South Africa being one of these main destinations, not the only one. So I'm going to briefly refer to a recent study that I actually had the privilege to comment, and it was a survey conducted in two border cities, Bridge and Musina, the border of Zimbabwe and South Africa, conducted by Doctors Without Borders and ACMS. And the findings, so they surveyed 1,346 migrants from Zimbabwe, DRC, Burundi. They didn't include Somalia, Ethiopia, and other nationalities. As showing you the big map, you find in this area, actually in this particular area, so many groups, migrants from different countries, trying to reach either South Africa as a transit or as a destination. But they found that most of them spent in average 9 months in this town, which is actually, then it doesn't, is an irony that a transit town becomes a town of them being stuck, waiting for job opportunities, waiting to get or renew papers because they didn't have any money to go anywhere. And this is also the result of the migration policy of South Africa, in that many offices to renew visas were closed. And so that forces migrants to either return to the city or stay there waiting for papers to be issued. And they might not even be issued at all. So the survey tried to capture the health status of these participants, and they were able to do it in quite a confidential way. In that I say so because the findings actually show quite a dramatic profile of them, and in affected by conditions that maybe in other forms they wouldn't have disclosed, such as, well, low diagnosis and treatment of chronic diseases, high percentages of people with unspecified signs and symptoms, high percentage of people living with STI, sexually transmitted infection, especially women, low knowledge of HIV, misconception about HIV, low HIV testing, high HIV prevalence among men and women, low family planning uptake, high use of traditional contraceptive methods, high rates of sexual violence, high rates of harmful consumption of alcohol, high rate of depression and suicide ideations among Central African men, low sense of social support for all population, high rates of anxiety and depression among women. I think it's quite a startling picture of how these people cope, right? How do they carry on with this sort of waiting to move to something better? And there was another section of the survey and tried to identify if they had asked for help, going to clinics, and not having papers is a deterrent for them to consult, right? Even though in the case of emergency care and pregnancy, the law grants rights to free care independently of documentation. Yet that is a barrier, and as we will see in the other studies. So in view of these different elements that compress frame the lives of these migrants, I want to call these precarious lives. And within the frame of precarious lives, look at maternal health. And the reference to precarious lives is not limited to the economics aspect or the increasing labor precariousness, as normally this term will apply. Precarious lives is precariousness that extends and erases the boundaries between the physical, the economic, the spiritual, and the social, and in doing so, extend and reformulates the very notion of precariousness. With reference to women's lives, this precariousness is also expressed in the conditions under which reproduction takes place. These are structural, political, and symbolic conditions that limit the possibility of migrant women not only of having healthy children, but also of preserving their lives in the process. Precarious lives results from structural violence, and this definition, I think it actually conveys what I want to say. The avoidable impairment of fundamental human needs, or the impairment of human life, which lowers the actual degree to which someone is able to meet their needs below that which would otherwise be possible. Okay, so when we talk about precariousness and precarious lives of migrants, definitely we need to consider xenophobia. And xenophobia in the context of South Africa being one of the most unequal countries in the world, and also, unfortunately, one of the most xenophobic. And these xenophobic countries, these structures of exclusion relate and feed into each other, because xenophobia for locals, for poor South Africans, is justified in the threat posed by foreigners in achieving the promise of equality and development offered by Mandela's democratic government. And from then on, in the view of many poor South Africans, foreigners come to take over their jobs, social housing, resources, and even their wives. So this picture was very. This is the extreme inequality and how even coexist spatially, though we know South Africa as the legacy of segregation, and that translates into space, but space also conveys the inequality, the starking differences between the rich and the poor. So this context needs to be taken into account to understand the xenophobic violence, this persistent inequality. And I align with these explanations of xenophobia without justifying it, but we need to understand, make sense of the irrationality. The project of national reconciliation of the Rainbow Nation in South Africa, inaugurated with the government of Mandela, has paradoxically contributed to the rise in xenophobia. This project of nationalist unity aimed at unifying and democratizing a deeply divided society has brought about an exclusionary and nationalist rhetoric that seeks to unify South Africans in contexts of extreme social inequality. And so to overcome the fact that the Nation Project has not changed the life of many South Africans who still are living in poverty, migrants are used as scapegoats. Migrants are not supposed to belong, and they are also an easy target. And this is, if you look for news on xenophobia, this is almost every day in the news. I just came across this because it's very related to what I'm trying to put here. The precariousness of life and how that might result in maternal mortality of migrant women, and how that reality is invisible. So this is a testimony of somebody who was attacked. Her family was attacked in Durban in 2019. So it says, it was a normal day. I went to work at the salon, came home for my husband, and went to bed. This is a 22 years old Malawian national who is 9 months pregnant. Then a violent mob broke down the door of her house, and she says, they started shouting and telling us to leave. They kept chanting that we must leave the country. They hit and kicked my husband. All I could think of was my unborn baby, my water breaking, and me giving birth in front of people who wanted us dead, she said. Another testimony of the same event, it says, Musa, Malawian as well. It was about 1 a.m. on a Monday when we were forced out of our rented rooms. I was with my baby and my husband. Even though they did not hurt us, after seeing that we had a small baby, they allowed us to leave with only the clothes we were wearing. We watched them as they took out all our furniture. So, this is somehow, the presence of a child, the woman pregnant, violence, is a complex. It's a complex construction of violence in context of precarity, and when so a baby can protect, but also you can feel threatened when you're about to give birth. And all of these, often though, you find that there are public officials, representatives, making political use of xenophobia. And these public utterances sometimes are followed by xenophobic violence. And you find that, the mayor of Gauteng, the health minister, the Zulu king who died recently, and the president himself have made xenophobic utterance in different moments, and these are read by the people as the legitimation of violence against migrants by local populations. Migrants have become the scapegoats to hide government deficiencies in crime fighting, in service delivery, and the collapse of the public health system, among other areas. And they sad the situation in which the same health minister publicly blamed migrant women from coming to give birth in South Africa, overcrowding the hospitals. And this was in the news. He did not retract from his words. And this somehow then legitimates what is being called in the literature medical xenophobia. That refers to these negative attitudes and practices of health professionals and employees towards migrants and refugees based purely in their identity as non-South Africans. And I'm going to jump a little bit because these are studies analyzed in particular how these medical xenophobia can be then read, identified in the context of actually also South Africans receiving bad quality of healthcare, workers being overworked, overburdened, and being frontline on dealing with big burdens of disease, and more so during COVID. But within this context of a crisis of the healthcare system, the identification of medical xenophobia is that when a patient is treated badly or denied treatment precisely because they are foreigners or denigrated verbally or physically for being non-South African. And there is medical evidence, there is evidence of medical xenophobia at work. How this operates by healthcare providers, in spite of the knowledge that the migrants have the right to access healthcare, they request documents before providing care. Trying migrants, putting them in a different line or at the end of the queue, or using a language that the migrants cannot understand, avoiding using a common language that would facilitate the interaction. I'm going to jump a little bit here so that I don't use up all the time. And I want to just say that we are, with my two colleagues, embarking in a quantitative analysis with Ava Jawal and Jairo Arrow, two quantitative specialists and public health specialists, trying to look at analyzing the data on causes of death that South Africa is being producing, and only recently categorizing the data according to nationalities. And we've been looking at causes of death, comparing female death and maternal mortality between South African nationals and migrants from the SADC countries. And we selected women in reproductive health between 15 to 49 years old and grouped them according to the ICD-10 codes. The SADC countries and the SADC migrants in South Africa constitute 70% of the total migrants. We conducted logistic regression to quantify the odds of dying due to maternal mortality for each population group. And only 2 slides left. And this is what we want to focus now and expand as much as the data allow us to do. This is a comparison between the profile of death, the distribution of female death between South Africans and migrants. The left-hand side is the South Africans the right-hand side is the SADC. We see they follow different trajectories, and we want to hypothesize what would be the explanation. The death of, in general, death of women decline with the access to antiretroviral around the 2004 on, and we see then a decline. It should have happened the same with women, migrant women, given that this is universal access to antiretroviral. But it spikes, and it spikes on the year of the xenophobic attacks of 2008, when there is an eruption of violence, and it doesn't go really down. We are comparing these two profiles and looking at maternal death or maternal mortality. They follow different trajectory, and we looking at the moments of a spike in violence, how it reflects also in terms of maternal mortality. We're not saying there's a direct relationship, because causes of death or reasons for maternal mortality are found even before women get to the clinics to give birth. They are really found in this precariousness of their lives, and this health profile that I referred to in the first part gives a context of how this pregnancy might occur. So it's not just the interaction or the exclusion that happens at the clinics, but it's a broader context. But it's striking that you find these moments of peaks associated to violence. And so we found that maternal death among foreign migrants is double than maternal death of South African women, twice higher, and this is statistically significant. This is an ongoing research quantifying the impact of social determinants of health and structural violence on migrant women and children. Maternal mortality among migrant women in South Africa is a silent phenomenon, unaccounted for. And through this analysis of maternal mortality, we want to highlight the failure of the system in protecting lives. Existing legislation that ensures access to healthcare is not enough. Okay, that is my presentation. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Lorena. And now we will have Alethia Fernández de la Reguera. Thank you, Alethia.
Hello, thank you very much. Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm going to start showing my presentation, sharing my screen. Just give me 1 second. Can you see my presentation now? Okay, thank you. So unfortunately, there are a lot of similarities on the findings that we just saw in Lorena's presentation. I'm going to present another scenario of African women who migrate to Latin America, and particularly to Mexico. And I'm going to particularly talk about the human rights violations and the impossibility to access health services at the southern border of Mexico. This is the border between Mexico and Guatemala. I have been conducting empirical research in this area for the last 4 years. And my main focus are Central American migrants, but since 2019, we started to see a clear change in migration flows and a bigger presence of African female migrants in this border, and with a particular situation that I'm going to start explaining now. But first, I would like to explain the big picture of the Mexico's context regarding migration and mobility. Mexico is a country that for many decades has been a country of origin for migrants to the US. But since the last 20 years, Mexico has shifted from being a country of origin to become a country of transit. And lately, maybe in the last 10 years, a country of destination of forced migrants, forced displaced people coming from Central America. And as regarding the flows of Africans, there are particularities to understand their strategies to cross Mexico to get to the US. It's important to say that migrants from African countries, their final destination is not Mexico, it's the US. But lately, they have been stuck for the last 2 years in Mexico without any possibility of international protection. And this is something that is understood only by understanding like the strategies or the reaction of the Mexican government with the increasing flows of Central American migrants, and the reaction or the response of the government has been the criminalization of migration. This map shows like the routes of African migrants. We need to understand that these are very complex trajectories. People who arrived to the Mexican territory have been migrating for at least 5 or 10 years. The common routes is that first they leave by land or sea from Europe or Dubai. They fly to the Caribbean or to Central or South American countries. The main countries of entry are Cuba, Brazil, and Ecuador. Sometimes they spend 2 or 3 or 4 years working in Chile or working in Brazil. And then once they have more capital to migrate to the north, they try to cross Mexico to get to the US. But these are very harsh territories, very dangerous territories. So they use, usually they have to go through these entry points with the assistance or by paying human smugglers or by being victims of human smugglers. These flows are not new in Mexico. I mean, what is different is that they are not able to easily cross the country. This graph is showing since 1995 till the year 2011, like the historical flows of African and people also from Asia who have been detained. The dark blue line shows the population coming from African countries that have been in detention centers in Mexico. And we can see an important peak that is in the year 2010, 2011. So we have been receiving people, and we have been the Mexican government, regardless of the administration, has been conducting this restrictive immigration policy, and detentions are not new. For the last 10 years, we have reported that people from African origin have been detained for long periods, between 2 weeks and almost 1 year in these detention centers. But they used to cross easily through Mexico because there are no deportation agreements between Mexican government and this government of Cameroon or Ghana or Congo. So what the government did is that they gave them a permit to cross the country for 40 days in order to get them to the US, and then they asked for asylum in the US. But at the end of the year 2018, there was a turning point in the Mexican migration scenario, and this is understood well, I don't know if you are familiarized with these pictures, with this situation of the Central American caravans that started to arrive at the end of 2018 and along 2019. These caravans are mostly Central American people who are fleeing from very extreme violent situations, and mainly women, people, elderly people, so people that need international protection. And the response of the Mexican government was, first, they were unprepared to receive the caravans, was higher controls in borders, the militarization also in points of entry in Mexico, and the opening of more temporary detention centers. So this clearly affected the African population, because before the caravans, they were, as I said, they were used to crossed through Mexico, even though in very dangerous situations, but it was just as a transit country, and they stayed in Mexico between 1 or 2 months. But now, since we had the Central American caravans, and the Mexican government started to increase the militarization controls, well, the African migrants in Mexico were very, very much affected by this, because they were stuck in the southern border. They were not allowed to cross the country. This permit that used to be given by the Mexican government to let them cross the country for 40 days was suspended. And for more than 6 months, many people stayed waiting outside. This picture is outside the offices of the Immigration Institute in Mexico, in the southern border of Mexico. So they were camping outside the offices, waiting for a response of the government. Within this context is where I started approaching the situation of African women in Mexico. I understood that they were in an immigration limbo. This is something that affects particularly people from African countries and also from other countries like India or Pakistan, because as I said, Mexico doesn't have a deportation agreement with these countries. So they were not able to continue their trip to the US, but also they were not able to ask for asylum procedures in Mexico. There's a lot of discrimination, just as Lorena showed in her presentation. One of the main problems here is xenophobia. Mexico has specific laws, immigration and refugee law, to offer international protection to people, to families that are fleeing from very harsh situations. But in the case of the African migrants, they were not basically informed about their right to ask for asylum in Mexico. And what also we started to see is that there was a peak in the detentions of Africans, and this includes women in detention centers in the southern border of Mexico. You can see the numbers. In 2014, Mexico registered 785 detentions of African origin migrants. And for the year 2019, only 5 years after that, this number has multiplied 10 times. And now we have 7,065 cases reported in the year 2019. The main countries of origin are Cameroon, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Eritrea, Ghana, and Somalia. And the main problem while they are detained is that they don't have access, of course, to translation services. And as I said, these detentions they are not temporal detentions. Sometimes they stay for 2, 3, even 6 months in detention because they don't have access to asylum procedures. And in the case of women, particularly, women also migrate, just as our first colleague in this panel presented. Women migrate also as mothers. The care work is part of female trajectories when they migrate between countries and borders. And the care work, or the responsibility of migrating as mothers or migrating while they are pregnant, is that sometimes they are completely responsible for the family, and they have limited access to the authorities. When they migrate with the family, the father or their husbands are the ones who are in contact with the authorities, so women have very limited access to information on their immigration status. The first problem is that they don't know that Mexico is a country where they have the right, first, to ask for asylum, and second, that even though they are irregular, Mexican law establishes that they have access to health and education services. The problem with these families is that they are very much discriminated. Mexico is a very racist country, especially with dark-skinned people. So what we saw in this border in Chiapas is that people were not, these migrants, especially women, they didn't go to the shelters. Even though there are important networks of shelters for Central American immigrants, in this case, African women are discriminated, or they don't have this access to the services not only provided by the government, but also by NGOs. It's like they are discriminated by being women, by being poor, by being Black, and of course by not being able to speak Spanish. Also, there is a lot of xenophobia. We saw that in the local media. A lot of newspapers were talking about this, or replying this global discourse of migrants, just as Lorena presented, migrants as people who bring disease or people who are dangerous for the countries where they arrive. And in this case, there is this representation of African people as if they were sick, or as if they were different. For example, now in times of COVID, what people are saying in this border in Chiapas, in the southern border of Mexico, is that it's strange that Black people don't get sick of COVID. They say, no, local people, they say they don't bring their mask and they don't get, they are not sick. They are not, they don't have the problem of COVID. So it's this idea of they don't bring the masks because they don't have access to sanitary kits, because they are not in contact with the shelters. They are barely in contact with some NGOs and some humanitarian assistance. But there is this representation of Africans as if they were very different. And before the COVID, they said they were bringing Ebola, and now they say it's strange that they don't get COVID. So in terms of talking particularly of women and health access, and particularly of pregnant women, it was a very, very harsh situation that we found, because in 2019, in this camp, there were more than 20 pregnant women. Some of them were in high-risk pregnancies, and they were not able to access the hospitals because, as I said, there are no translation services, of course, because they don't know they have the right to access a hospital. And there are many barriers. First, of course, what I studied is like the institutional violence mechanisms. So even though they might know from another person that they can arrive to the hospital, well, the first respondent of the hospital, the one that is in charge of receiving, of giving like the first response to the people that arrive to the hospital, they don't understand that they have the right, or they are obliged to give access to health services. So women, at the end, they don't want to approach the authorities to go to the hospital until the very, very, very last moment before giving birth. There is a lot of obstetric violence, and this is not only a situation that happens to African women. This is something that has been researched in Mexico. This is something that is very common for Mexican women as well, who give birth in public hospitals. But in the case of African women, they are even more discriminated, and their human rights are violated because they, of course, they don't speak the language, but also the authorities and the local public servants or the local doctors, they don't understand that they are obliged to give the service. There are cases of medical negligence. There are cases of neonatal deaths. And well, what we're seeing now is that the mechanisms established legally legally in our frameworks in Mexico, they don't, even though they include by constitution African descendants and African migrants, in practice these are euphemisms because they don't have real access to the services that they should be they should access. So the main actors, the ones that are actually giving a good response, or at least a humanitarian response to these communities, are, of course, civil society and international organizations. Basically, some of the cases have been solved by, like, in a casuistic way, in a casuistic strategy, that we have been contacting directly some social workers in that border. And we directly put, when I say we, is the group of researchers or some NGOs based in Mexico City, we need to contact someone in Chiapas to have a direct contact with these women. But this is something that is not institutional and is something that is not helping many people, just some particular cases. So what the main actors are Médecins du Monde, Médecins Sans Frontières, and local NGOs that are actually with very few resources trying to give access to health services in public hospitals in Tapachula. So just to end my presentation, and maybe we can discuss further in the Q&A session, is that in Mexico, health is a human right that is conditioned by the immigration status and race. And in the case of African women, the ways they are discriminated and human rights violations are understood in an intersectional way, because they suffer many different obstacles, institutional obstacles, but also cultural obstacles, and also a lot of misinformation from the side of the Mexican society, that we have these communities that arrive to Mexico, that they need international protections, that they are not in transit to the US, or that they are not allowed to be in transit anymore. This is something that we need to understand also, that these policies are completely connected with the US policy, with the administration of Donald Trump that closed the borders is also to asylum seekers. So this is affecting the possibility of establishing these basic human rights and basic services for African women who are suffering a lot of racism, discrimination. And one of my main concerns is that they are not even able to access the precarious, but still the important networks of humanitarian aid that are established in this border and that are managed by the NGOs and by local activists. And they are even in the periphery of this humanitarian aid. So I'm just finishing my presentation with this reflection on how harsh and the deep impacts of intersectionality to understand the African women trajectories through Mexico. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Alethia. And now we will continue with Nair. Nair, it's a pleasure to see you again. Thank you, Nair.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, first of all, congratulations for this wonderful event. All the panels have been very interesting. I think I will have to re-listen to many of the participations. I have made lots of notes for my students. So I think this kind of organization has to be repeated as much as we can. Well, I'm going to talk. This lecture is a little bit different from the migratory concerns. I am going to talk about the work of two very important novelists, Aidoo and Erna Brodber, and the alternative views of feminism that they propose. Contemporary African and Caribbean women writers have played a central role in interrogating the position of women in the modern world. Their work deals with issues that range from questioning the role of tradition and hierarchical values, both African and Western, to a wider concern for the ways in which post-coloniality has been able to dismantle a number of hierarchies that continue to profoundly affect women nowadays. In their works, Aidoo from Ghana and Erna Brodber from Jamaica have not only defied the hierarchy imposed by the hegemonic literary conventions of the West, but have also put forward in challenging ways the need to elaborate new forms of thinking alternative feminisms from within their own socio-cultural milieus. Their concern goes beyond the issue of how African or Afro-descendant women are represented in literature. Rather, they often satirize such representations in order to subvert colonial discourse as a first step to open critical gaps in between spaces in which African women can exercise an agency usually denied them in the popular imaginary. Aidoo has been very vocal in her insistence that women in Africa should not be evaluated in the terms of white Western feminism and even of American womanism, partly because they fail, according to her, to account for the diversity and the complexity of the African context, but also because for her those forms of feminism perpetuate patronizing colonial views of Africa. So perhaps her first feminist concern is to explore the ways in which women, and I quote, and it's Aidoo speaking, can break out of the prison of confining roles, end of quote. Aidoo is aware of the important contributions of Black American feminism and its accompanying notion of womanism, which, apart from emphasizing the significance of the consciousness of sexual and gender issues, incorporates a more intersectional perspective. That is, it also takes into account racial, cultural, economic, national, and political considerations. However, she is suspicious of the dangers of essentializing the African experience, which the notion of womanism might imply, and of whether, I quote, we women of African descent are also inadvertently limiting our capacity to understand ourselves, which in turn could weaken our capacity to deal effectively with the predicament we find ourselves in. What Aidoo points to in this quote constitutes one of the issues marked by a number of studies on African feminism. Marie-Paule Ebo, for instance, begins her chapter, The Woman Question, African and Western Perspectives, in the Anthology of African Philosophy, published by Blackwell in 1998, mentioning the difficulties of dealing with a definition of what constitutes a modern African woman in Western terms. The first indetermination that arises from this notion is that the modern African woman, and between quotation marks, and I quote, is not seen as an authentic African. She is seen as a Philistine woman or as a westernized woman tinctured with traditionalism. The second indetermination is the simplified view that supposedly traditional African women are weak, oppressed, and marginalized both by African patriarchal structures and by the structures of post-coloniality. How to reconcile these two ambiguities and how to offer proactive solutions has been the aim of critics such as Philomena Steady, who considers that African feminism takes into consideration, and I quote, female autonomy and cooperation, an emphasis on nature over culture, the centrality of children, multiple mothering and kinship, the use of ridicule in the African women's world view, a number of traditional rights and responsibilities of women, end of quote. These are features which, in fact, quote again, makes the African woman much more a feminist than her Western counterpart. The importance and acknowledgement of kinship and sisterhood is a determining force in African feminism and constitutes a central topic in the work of a number of African and Afro-Caribbean women writers. In her plays, novels, and short stories, Aidoo articulates these concerns in texts that explore the complex situation of women in episodes where the contradictions between traditional and modern practices overlap and intersect, and always within the wider framework of the impact of colonialism in Ghana. Her writings are marked by a profound awareness of migration and diaspora, and she is especially concerned for the possible blindness that might accompany people who have worked or studied abroad, the Bintus. Her topics go from the struggles of rural women to make ends meet and the cultural and economic impoverishment brought by modernity, to the debates about wearing wigs and skin lightening creams as part of changing concepts of beauty, to the more extreme subject, for example, of a modern, educated Ghanaian woman who accepts a polygamous marriage. In all of them, Aidoo refuses to victimize her characters and concentrates instead on the resilient ways in which they exercise their agency and autonomy and take responsibility for their actions, as painful as they might be. The emphasis placed on the fact that the personal and the political are interrelated opens up significant paths to analyze how the poignant vitality of African creativity and artistic expression constantly questions and disrupts the hegemonic impact of post-coloniality. On the other side of the Black Atlantic, Erna Brodber's work offers a view of feminism which, apart from highlighting issues of agency, autonomy, and sisterhood, takes into consideration the significance of spiritual practices and traditions of African origin, such as Mial and Kumina. Aware of the profound psychological and psychic repercussions of the violent dislocation caused by the Middle Passage, Brodber sustains her concerns on what critics have termed a poetics of redemption. In novels like Mial and Jane and Louise Will Soon Come Home, she explores the ways in which Jamaican characters, especially women, have to struggle against the continuing impact of the overall imposition of a colonial British worldview achieved through religion's conversion and an education based on the English literary canon. Brodber calls this whole conversion process spirit thievery, according to a perspective derived from the Afro-based religions of the region. Thus, her novels trace the process of coming into consciousness of her female protagonists in order to comply to her leading concern. According to Antonia MacDonald, and I quote, Brodber sets herself the task of piecing together a conflicted and fragmented Caribbean past, so that in the process of her creative reassemblage, diasporic Caribbean people can claim their painful past, acquiring in the process a healing that produces self-knowledge, and more particularly, knowledge of self in relation to community. Her view of feminism involves different forms of female engagements with the community, so that there is a clear break with the Western paradigm of individualism, a paradigm that in the context of her novels has led the female protagonists to suffer some sort of mental illness. Thus, for her, feminism is not an achieved, fixed state, but consists in the process of confronting the established, institutionalized factors that usually discriminate and marginalize women. The works of Aidoo and Brodber constitute good instances of how, through literature, authors can both explore the paradoxes of postcoloniality and offer decolonizing options in the field of culture. To begin with, they break with the narrative conventions usually ascribed to Western works. Their novels are inscribed in frameworks in which complex uses of orality and of narrative perspectives sustained in local and traditional myths articulate the notion of self-apprehension put forward by Wole Soyinka. The fact that both the form and content of their works come from within their cultures contribute to enhance the social function of literature of African and Caribbean works. For Aidoo and Brodber, the Western phrase of art for art's sake that continues to prevail in certain spheres has no meaning at all. For them, both the act and process of writing and the act and process of reading involve an effort of unveiling the difficulties offered by texts in order to confront our own internalized colonialisms and racisms, to learn from the experience of reading and to, like the protagonists of her works, assume responsibility for self and community. This self-reflexivity is one very important step for their overall view of feminism. Both Aidoo and Brodber offer alternative views of feminism, which can involve the following aspects. One is the significance of obtaining freedom from ignorance by means of restoring to African-based cultural practices. Second, the process of acknowledging the importance of the community and of hearing to the multiple voices that configure it, leaving aside the individualism promoted by Western thought. Third, highlighting resilience and strength as a major value in women, a value that has characterized them both in the past and in the present. Fourth, recognizing the agency and autonomy that has been a distinguishing feature of African women, as well as recognizing the role they have played in the configuration of modern African and Caribbean societies. Aidoo and Brodber anticipate many of the intellectual concerns that are fructifying in Africa, in America, or the American continent, in recent years, and that can be found in works of female historians, philosophers, and sociologists like Nwando Acheves, the daughter of Chinua, who has written two wonderful history books called The Female Kings and King of Nigeria, and Female Monarchs and Merchant Queens in Africa. Mercy Amba Aduyoyes, Daughters of Anoa, African Women and Patriarchy. Oyeronki Oyewomis, The Invention of Women, Making an African Sense of Western Gender Discourses, and Sylvia Tamales, Decolonization and Afrofeminism. Just to close on an anecdotic note, I would like to point out that Ama Ata Aidoo's I would like to point out to Ama Ata Aidoo's influence on contemporary culture by observing that her words and ideas form an integral part of the album Twice as Tall of the Nigerian rapper Burna Boy, who just last week was awarded the Grammy for Best Global Music Album. That's all for now.
Thank you very much, Nair. And last but not least, we are going to have Rubén Peña. Thank you very much, Rubén.
Hey, good morning, everybody. Well, first, I want to. Can you hear me? Yes. Okay. First, I want to thank the committee for the invitation, and also say I'm so happy to share the panel with the colleagues. Their presentations were very interesting. I want to share with you some ideas about the social mobilization and the women role in the process that overthrew the Omar al-Bashir government in Sudan. As you know, in Sudan, as in other countries in North Africa, the people took the streets to demonstrate their discontent with the political and economic situation. This in the late of 2010 and the beginning of 2011. Popular demonstrations against Omar al-Bashir government erupted in the Sudan's capital in Khartoum, and also in other important cities like Al Obeid in late January in 2011, and continued for the next 2 years due to the rising of commodity prices. Unlike Tunisia and Egypt, internal and external factors allowed the Sudanese government to remain in power. In December 2018, the Sudanese people returned to the streets to protest for the highest price of bread. Popular demands quickly focused on the resignation of the president. Finally, President Omar al-Bashir was deposed in April 2019, and a transitional military was established. Unlike what happened in Egypt, the social protest did not stop until the formation of a transitional council led by civilians. It is interesting to note that not only did the popular protests end the regime of more than 30 years, but it was the result of a social process from the communities, from the streets, with a key role of the various sectors of the Sudanese. But I want to highlight the participation of women in this process in a country with serious difficulties in free expression and political freedom. Well, I want to talk about contextualize the last period of Omar al-Bashir government. The last decade was marked by accentuated internal political crisis and the consequent repression of any political opposition. The social discontent caused by the accentuated economic crisis, the impoverishment of the population, Omar al-Bashir's strategy to overcome the challenging internal context was to hold general multi-party election in April 2010. The first held under his rule, by the way. Opposition leaders argued that the elections were neither free nor reliable, and it was only a quarter of al-Bashir to legitimize the regime, not his government. And then the popular Arab revolts at the end of 2011 influenced it has an impact on the Omar al-Bashir positions. Omar al-Bashir used the acceptance of the result of the Sudan region's independence referendum as a sign of change in the country's political situation and the beginning of a new era in Sudan. This explained to a large extent why the popular revolts in 2011 didn't have a consequence deep into Sudan, one of the countries in the region with serious internal problems, conflicts in different regions, lack of political legitimacy, and economic crisis. After 2 years, in 2013, protests broke out against the increase of more than 60% in the prices of the fuel, on the oil. The increase was the result of the inability to reach an agreement on the exploitation of oil and the consequent political confrontation between the government of Sudan and the South Sudan government, which led to a shutdown of the oil sector during the first half of 2012. The situation in the country didn't get better, even it got worse the following years. In December 2018, the Sudanese people took the streets again to express their discontent with the economic situation. On this occasion, the protesters, demonstrations began in the province of Atbara in the north of Sudan, in the north of the country, as a result of the rise in the food prices, in particular the rising cost of bread. The demonstrations quickly spread to other provinces and cities in Sudan, including the capital, Khartoum. As the protest intensified, the demand also changed. At the beginning, the speeches demand a change in an economic agenda to reduce food prices, but it was long before they focused on the impeachment of the president. During the demonstrations in 2019, the image of a young woman encouraging the protester with slogan and singing quickly became an icon of the social revolution. The figure of Salah, this young woman, from the point of view of the Western media, challenged the stereotypes of oppressed and political passive Muslim women. The international media focused on the act of Salah, considering it something exceptional, losing sight of the central role of Sudanese women throughout the process, throughout the revolution, and without considering the historical participation of Sudanese women in the political issues of the country. So it's important to point it out that the participation of Sudanese women in social mobilization is not an isolated case. Even it is not a recent in the African country. In fact, an important group of women played a central role in the political and social sphere in shaping the Sudan state, the modern Sudan state. Just for mention a few of them, Khalida Zahir, for example, that she was the first female member of the Student Union in 1947, and she participated in the peace negotiation in the South Sudan, and also she founded the Young Women's Cultural Society in 1948. Another example is Fatima Ahmed Ibrahim. She was also a Sudanese feminist and political activist. She was the first woman to be elected and deputy in the parliament as a member of the Communist Party in 1965. Also, in 1947, she was created the Association of Intellectual Women, a co-founder of the Union of Sudanese Women. Another example is Fatima Talib Ismail, a Sudanese educator and activist for the women's rights. And also she became the first female member of the Muslim Brotherhood in Sudan. But it's important to note that the majority of political and feminist activists such as those I mentioned recently, are women from Central and North Sudan, from families with links to academic and political or military circles. In this sense, the fundamental role of women should be highlighted in the last revolution, in the last social mobilization. The working class and women from marginalized regions serve as drivers of resistance against the regime, political marginalization, and the state violence. especially in the last decade of the al-Bashir government. During the popular mobilization in 2018 and 2019, as the protests gained momentum, rural women took the opportunity to take to the streets and denounce the socio-economic situation and the atrocities in their own communities. In addition, a group of them traveled to Khartoum to continue supporting the protest and to ensure popular demands were met. In the same way, the historical context in which the social mobilization and the important participation of women take place must be considered. Since Omar al-Bashir came to power, one of the sectors that suffered the most from the government action was women. The harassment of women journalists, artists, or political opponents by security officials was very common during Omar al-Bashir government. Also, the government action were not only focused on political active women, rather it systematically undermined the economic activities of working class women. For example, the government banned tea vendors from working in the center of Khartoum. So women who their work was sell the tea, this action affected more than 300 women in 2017 and their families, of course. In response, the vendors organized in the Food and Beverage Vendors Association mobilized to demand the ban should be revoked. When women took to the street in Khartoum and other cities across the countries to protest alongside the rest of the society, also they faced the brutality from Omar al-Bashir security apparatus. The protesters were arrested. These women were arrested, tortured, and killed by the security forces along with the rest of the protesters, and has been documented by organizations like Human Rights Watch that a significant number of those arrested were sexually assaulted. Demonstration and demands in the Sudanese streets continue. The repression against the protesters intensified, in particular in June of in June 2019, and negotiation between the protesters agglomerate in the force for the freedom and change, and military led to formation of a new body led by civilians and military. Without doubt, I think the creation of the Sovereignty Council was a battle won by the Sudanese people. The appointment of Abdallah Hamdok as a prime minister also positively perceived among the protesters and the political opposition. There are great expectations that the new government can manage the economic problems of the country. Now, regarding gender equality, the appointment of state governors is a positive sign of the government head by Abdallah Hamdok. To date, 18 civilians have been appointed as governors, among whom are women, an unprecedented situation in the country. However, also these attempts toward gender equality in political participation have been one of the challenges faced by the prime minister. The election of some governors faced serious difficulties, including resistance from some local and political forces. Despite political pressure and resistance for some sector of the Sudanese society to women participation, the prime minister has continued his position on gender equality. The aforementioned actions are not a guarantee of political transition in Sudan, but they represent considerable sign of change in Sudan society and Sudan political system. In this sense, and since the way in which the protesters were developed has been analyzed, it can be argued. First, the participation of women in political process in Sudan is not recent. It should be noted that the women came from regions outside the Khartoum and from different social sectors, mainly the working class. This is a different point I like to highlight. Two, women were integrated into the new government. Also, this is a positive sign in this new government. And the last one, the people of Sudan, through the demands emanating from the street, have won two important battles in the war for the consolidation of political transition in the country. First, the removal of Omar al-Bashir and the formation of the council led by civilians. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Rubén. Thank you very much, everyone, for these insightful presentations. I would like to open the floor to you to interact with each other. Also, we have the Q&A chat box for those who are watching us. If you want to ask questions, please go ahead and do so. Rubén has to leave, but I will start with Tamara. Tamara, if you could please start with a question or a comment in regards to what our colleagues presented.
No pressure. Well, I wanted to make a point that I didn't feel that I elaborated, and I think that has come up, that potentially would be useful because the idea behind it has come up to in other presentations. And that's that movement is still, like when we talk about legal migration, legal movement is still very much based on citizenship. And then that doesn't really make sense in a context, in a continent where, as Mambi has shown in his detailed account of citizenship in Africa, it doesn't make sense in a context in which people don't have access to citizenship because of colonial imposed ethnicities, or because they don't have access to documentation because the bureaucracies that were left behind don't function in the way that they were designed, but also create requirements and paperwork that follows people around. So I wonder whether, like, especially in terms of thinking about belonging and questioning, sort of, I mean, immediately, of course, I have a lot in common with Lorena in terms of our engagement with xenophobia in South Africa and how people will put their South Africanness and use their South African status as a reason to attack somebody else who, even though they may even be indebele or have stronger historical ties that national citizenship doesn't offer them. So I wonder whether that comes up in other people's work, the citizenship, how we get past it in contexts where citizenship doesn't actually make sense for movement and the effects of movement.
Thank you, Tamara. I don't know who wants to answer. Alethia, Lorena?
Well, maybe I would like to comment on my colleagues' work. I suspected that we were going to have many things in common in our projects, and like our framework of analysis is structural violence. I would like to learn more about the xenophobic violence, as I understood, is think, because I also use these authors. I work with Paul Farmer and with Galtung as frameworks to understand these processes of women migrating through Mexico. But xenophobic violence, I understand it as a way of, as an expression of cultural violence and structural violence. But also, I would like to know more about how you work, Lorena, on the definition of xenophobic violence from the point of view of the institutions. And here I think that what Tamara is also saying is that what we are seeing is that migration theories and migration policies are planned under this idea of having in one side labor migration and in one side you have forced migration. And we need to reflect on how the need to be more flexible with these categories, because voluntary and involuntary migration trajectories are very much connected, and it's very but however, in terms of legal frameworks, in terms of policies, in terms even of theories of thinking of migration, we are still having these two separate categories, and the reality is giving us a very complex picture of how to understand it. So this is just like a comment, but a question for Lorena is to learn more about the institutional perspective, because here we have, just as in the Mexican case, we have not only the military forces or the immigration authorities in these countries, but we also have many other actors. We have the health services actors, we have the public hospitals, the private hospitals, we have the NGOs, we have these international organizations that are the ones who have more ways to interact or to have like the idea of where are these people located and what are their needs. And particularly in the case of women, even though in the Mexican case we have this gender perspective in our immigration law, we don't have budgets with a gender perspective. We don't have any real political commitment to understand that women who migrate, they have very particular needs in terms of reproductive and sexual health services. So it was just between a comment and a question. And in the case of Nair, I really enjoy your project. I don't know if you have something that could be published, because we need to learn more in the Latin American context of this very interesting perspective of how to understand feminism and how to establish a dialogue between the Western concepts of empowerment and agency and what you presented. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you for the comment and the question. And I want to just take the opportunity to ask Nair if we could have access to your paper. And I was taking notes of the authors and the books, and feeling, as well as Alethia says, the need for us to engage and put these women in conversation. And we probably will find more more tuned our analysis if we consider the voices of women, feminist women, both in Africa and Latin America. We've been mediated by colonial analysis and colonial categories that we need to overcome and be able to find more indigenous languages in all respects. So I really would like to have the time and read it again. So Tamara also, Tamara is talking about a citizenship. Alethia is talking about, how xenophobia does play differently in different contexts, and asking if the institutional, what is the role of the institution in reproducing, tolerating, endorsing xenophobia. Well, the government says there isn't xenophobia. Officially, the government doesn't accept that there is xenophobia. It would put them in a very bad light with regard to the rest of Africa, no? This construction of collective voices and big colonial processes that all governments have embarked on. To admit that officially the xenophobia is to betray the brotherhood, and I'll say brotherhood, right? And so it's difficult to address it from an institutional aspect when there is denialism. What they say these days is criminality, not xenophobia. It's just crime. And actually, some authors have spoken about Afrophobia, but I think there's something deeply there around poverty, inequality, and how one turns against the weakest that is next to him or her. The wealthier protect themselves behind walls and barriers and securities. They're not exposed. Is the poor, the scarcity of and the unfulfilled promise of a new society, equity and access to the wealth of this country that people feel angry about, and so by excluding and being violent against those who are next to them but weaker, they think they're going to get a piece of the cake that is already so badly distributed, so that the bigger piece is for the wealthier and the small is for the large number of poor people in South Africa that stay poor 20 years after democracy. So it's difficult to address from an institutional perspective, because I think they are complicit and somehow scapegoating migrants in the face of the failure to service the promise that this country made to his people. Yeah, there's no much way out. These have been the civil society, international organizations, and churches and so on, trying to hold this, right? And I'm thinking, like, what if we were to put to the SADC community, right, the countries, and they're at the top level, this is what is happening with your citizens in South Africa. Nigeria did something interesting. When xenophobic attacks were directed against Nigerians, because sometimes these attacks are focalized in different communities. Nigerians first did also attack South African businesses in Nigeria, but it created a big international problem. And South Africa was not wanting to admit the xenophobia. They kept saying this is not against you. And I don't know how they solved the international relationship issue that came about when this happens against Nigerians. They were chartered back to Nigeria, a group of them. The government took an active role. Well, that's what I can share. Tamara maybe wants to add something else.
Sorry, maybe Nair wants to say something. And then there is a question for you, Nair, as well. There is a comment. I'm not going to read it, but there is a question. Do you find any similarities if we compare Aidoo's work with other feminist Mexican, Latin American writers such as Amparo Dávilas or Rosario Castellanos?
And also Alethia wants to.
Yes.
Also, Alethia wants to talk. I also enjoyed very much your papers. And even though I am sort of outside the more sociological and political aspects of studying African and the African diaspora, for me, reading the literature has been very enriching, because I think especially the work of African and Caribbean authors, both male and female, because if you see the question of xenophobia, for instance, of course it has other aspects around, but it is based, let's say, on the issue of representation and how these ideas of representation continue to be so deep inside the people, and it is so difficult to take them out and to discuss them and to actually make you think differently, that all the time we have this kind of rejection of the other, no? In different aspects. So I think really that trying to think more about the repercussions of this kind of permanent negative representation. Rubén was saying how women were seen as weak and almost invisible. And you see all over Africa, as also all over America, women who really fight back even when they are living in precarity, and when they have the opportunity to talk and to express themselves and to have a voice, a public voice, you can see everything that we have, not these wonderful thinkers that really make us reflect about everything that is happening. So I think lots of social and political studies could gain insight from the works of literature. And considering them in relationship, for instance, to Rosario Castellanos, the Mexican female writers, and Amparo Dávila as well, of course, they are actually offering a voice about the role, the situation of women, no? And they continue to talk about, even though they don't express it in a self-reflexive way all the time, they are speaking about how being a woman means some kind of marginalization. But I think that there is, I don't know if I should say this, but that somehow they deal with the other, in the case of Rosario Castellanos, of the indigenous population, still from the other side of the table. And what happens with this African and Afro-Caribbean is that they are within the culture, they are the ones that have been discriminated against, if you see what I mean.
Thank you, Nair. Alethia, you have a question?
Well, not a question, it will be a comment, but I'm going to be very brief, just like to trigger a discussion and to have some homework for everybody. Well, first, this week arrives Roberta Jacobson, who is the former ambassador of USA in Mexico, and now she is in charge of the borders of USA. Mm-hmm. And I saw in the journal, in the newspaper, in the front page of Reforma, a man who was showing her the detention centers. So my question is, if I really if I understand what the newspaper show, because it shows like Mexico, the government of Mexico was showing her the detention centers that we have around the country especially for the Central American people that are crossing Mexico to arrive to USA. The second thing that I want to say is that the only way to not to stop migration, because migration is a natural process, is that one of the principal things is that the governments, and especially not only the Central American governments, also is for the African and for Mexico and the South American governments, is that they must reorganize their budgets to increase employment. And the thing that I said in the CSW 65 just on Tuesday, we have a session in this in United Nations with the FEMU, the Mexican University Federation, and also with Canada and USA academic federations that to try to, not to finish, as I said, but to improve women is to have a full woman employment program. And I give this idea because I think it is very important to begin to give some alternatives. The idea of a full woman employment program, we must try at least that our governments and the parliament talk about employment. But employment, of course, men needs employment, but especially for women employment. And that will be everything. Thank you very much, Arturo.
Thank you, Alethia. I think we are running out of time. We started also a little bit late, so I just wanted to compensate with the minutes that we lost. I think that it's very interesting and sad to see the cases of Mexico and obviously South Africa, Southern Africa, in terms of the blindness of the government and the authorities to acknowledge the problems of xenophobia in both countries. So different contexts, but basically it's the same problem, the lack of acknowledgement of these issues. And obviously what it's not acknowledged cannot be put forward into the policies and agendas in the political scenario. Thank you so much, everyone, for your wonderful contributions. And I will give the floor now to Hector. We're going to start with our next and final panel. Thank you very much. Have a good evening and a good afternoon.
Thank you, Arturo. Thank you.